Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Focal Elegia. That's right, Elegia. Not Elegia, Elegia. I gotta say, I don't do the unboxing thing usually, but the presentation of this is pretty damn awesome. It's fairly similar to what you would expect if you know what the clear comes with. So it does come with this nice case. The main exception is that it doesn't come with the second or third cable. The clear comes with an XLR cable. The Elegia instead just comes with this one very basic, almost a little bit too short cable. But I actually don't mind the cable being a little bit shorter because I sit fairly close to the desk. So the Elegia uses a similar driver to what they're doing with the clear with the rest of their lineup. So it is that M-shaped dome driver that is formerless, so it's quite fast. However, I'm also led to believe that this is a custom driver in here, so this is not the same one that's in the clear. They did have to create it. I don't believe this is the one that goes in the other headphones. I feel like there's a difference in what's going on internally in terms of the headband design. The clear seems a little bit more robust, but this also seems a little bit lighter, which is surprising because it's also a closed back. It feels fairly sturdy in terms of build, and there is a little bit of a swivel to the cups, a little bit of give, and I really like that because there are other headphones like the Sundara, for example, that just hang out there and there's nothing you can do to make it actually fit properly. This is a spring-loaded action here, so it does conform to your head quite nicely. I find on a comfort level that the clamp is a little bit tight on this. It's not actually as bad as it might first feel, because once it's on your head, you really don't notice the clamp at all. And even though I normally prefer a suspension strap style, similar to this guy here, like the Night Owl, don't read too much into that. There isn't really like a hot spot on the top of your head because this is really soft here. And it's also very thick across the board. Like this is a very thick headband, so it distributes the weight quite evenly. So the big question on everybody's mind when it comes to the Elegia is this as good as the Clear or the LX? I have very briefly heard the LX, and I still actually prefer the Clear to the LX. So that's kind of where my preferences lie. And to me, the Elegia falls right in between the Clear and the LX in terms of its performance qualities. The tuning is a little bit different, and we'll get to that in a second. But first, let's talk about the performance. I do want to mention that I'm driving this off of my Cayenne IHA6 balanced. I have used this on other devices, but that's sort of my primary driver, and I do use the XLR connector from the cable with the XLR connector from the Clear. And while it doesn't come with that, if you're not rocking a Clear, you don't just have one handy, you should probably just buy a cable from Periapt or somewhere else if you do want to run it balanced. The Clear, to me, has crazy good resolution and detail. The Elegia borrows that from the Clear. It's got the same kind of resolution and detail. However, this is a closed back design and the Clear is open, so there's advantages gained with the Clear that you can't do the same thing with the closed back. One of the challenges with making a closed back is you got to figure out a way to ensure that there aren't any resonances that come off the back of the cup. And so for a lot of other closed backs, you'll see a sort of damping material that they put in between the back of the driver and the cup, and that absorbs any resonances or standing waves that occur. And then there's also a porting mechanism here with some foam over this logo, which actually is where the air escapes from. And that's really cool, and you'd think, well, does this isolate, given that there's actually a porting mechanism here? And the answer is yes, it does. And so much so that I'm absolutely blown away with how quiet this is when somebody else is listening to it and you're right next to it. The way that they've dealt with the damping question is they've actually designed the back of the cup to be a little bit more like what you'd find in a recording studio. So there are these little box-shaped pieces on the inside of the cup that absorb standing waves the same way that you would see in a properly engineered room for recording, and that helps deaden the sound so you're not dealing with these resonances coming through off the back of the cup. Now, is it the same as the Clear in terms of its performance? Well, no, it's not. You still can't quite get to the same kind of openness that you get with an open back when you seal it off like this. However, they do get pretty darn close, and I think this gets closer to the clear than it does to the LX in terms of its performance and tonality. So because this uses the same kind of driver that they have in their other line and the rest of their headphones, this sort of M-shaped dome driver that's also formorless, it is a very fast driver, and that means that essentially it's got close to planar speed. As far as the resolution goes, I would say this is about 90% of the way there to the clear. And again, I don't know if the extra 10% is because of the closed off factor, or if that's just, if there's other things in the tuning and the frequency response that make it difficult to tell. The struggle is trying to get this to sound just like a clear with EQ and then making a comparison. From my attempts at EQing it, I think I've gotten a little bit closer, and I can safely say that the resolution is pretty damn close. I would consider this an absolute detailed monster. I've said this in my written, one of my write-ups, that I hear detail from this headphone and the clear as well that I don't like. I don't even hear that in the ZMF Auteur. Like, I love the Auteur, and we'll get into the comparisons a little bit later, but the detail that you get from this and the resolution and the microdynamics is just on another level. So let's get into the tuning. The bass of the Elegia is one of the more contentious issues because there's a dip right between 100 and 200 hertz that makes it sound like it's a bit thin if you're not using tracks that will make full use of the frequency range. So if the track that you're playing doesn't have anything that goes lower than 120 hertz, it'll sound like there's a bass roll off essentially. But if you're listening to music that does go below 120 hertz, where there's there's a rise to have more bass than even the clear, then it sounds rich and full, and there's enough bass you would never ask for more. With that said, because of the dip, it's not as appropriate for a wide range music. You can't just throw on anything and expect it to sound as full and rich as something like the Icon, for example. And so for that reason, I actually do EQ up that region between 100 and 200 hertz by about 2 dB. I don't really think that it's worth going much higher than that, because one of the things I like about this is that it will reveal when there's a lack of frequency range, and so you can really tell the difference between a well mastered and well recorded piece of music versus one that's maybe not quite taking as much advantage of the dynamic range available. The other thing to keep in mind with the bass response of the Elegia is that they're very susceptible to fit. So for example, if you're wearing glasses, it can totally ruin the bass response. And then the pads are actually responsible for a large amount of the lower frequencies. And so if you do try and pad swap, it's got to be something pretty close to this. Otherwise, it'll totally mess up the frequency response. I tried the Brainwaves pads on this, and it boosted it. And I know other people have tried perforated pads, and it's completely cut the bass out. So I would just stick with these. They're quite comfortable. There have been some reports of people trying these on at audio shows and going, well, where's the bass? And that's likely because of one of several different possibilities. Either that they weren't using tracks that extended below 100 hertz, or they didn't have quite the right fit, or they were wearing glasses. Even if you're wearing this on your head and you don't have glasses on and you're adjusting it a little bit, you do hear changes in the frequency response, especially to the bass. So keep that in mind, that when you're reading these reports, it's likely one of those factors. The bass, you can even confirm this with measurements, the bass does go above where the clear is at, below 100 hertz. So the sub bass and mid bass is definitely present, and you won't miss it at all. And it's the upper bass where there's a bit of that dip that if you do feel like it's lacking, you can just EQ that up by a few dB. With that said, because of this dip in the 100 to 200 hertz region, there is absolutely no bleed into the mid-range. And the mid-range proper is just incredible on this headphone. It's probably some of the best I've ever heard. And I actually would go as far as to say that there's a little bit of an elevation to the mids that's maybe a little bit north of neutral. So if you are EQing, you could probably, bump that down by maybe 1 or 2 dB. I kind of like it though. Like I'm a mids kind of guy. So for me, that's a lot of fun, especially if you're into music with a lot of piano or vocals, acoustic music with vocals. The vocals come through on this like nothing else. It's really quite spectacular. Then when you get into the upper mid-range and lower treble region, the frequency response starts to get a bit weird. Some people have referred to the whole focal line as being a little bit metallic sounding. So while I wouldn't use that adjective, I can understand why, and this is probably the region that causes that. And I found that if you just elevate a little bit of the region around 3K and 4K, a little bit of an elevation for the lower treble region, and then bringing it right back down again at the sibilance range, right between like 8.5 and 9K, that can help with some of that timbre. The nice thing about the treble is that for whatever reason, and maybe it's to do with the way that they did the damping in the back of the cup, but this is a closed-back headphone that doesn't sound like a closed-back headphone. Like, okay, yeah, it does sound like a closed-back headphone, but it is in the category of closed-backs. It's one of the more open and airy and spacious sounding closed-backs. In the concession that you have to make when you make it closed-back, minimizing that is the biggest challenge. And I want to say that they got maybe 90% of the way there, like with the difference between the Elegia and the Clear. Like, it's very close. And apart from that slightly different tuning, with this being more a mid-focused headphone and the Clear being a little bit less mid-focused, like I think that the Clear is probably a little bit more accurate because it doesn't have as much of that just mid-range proper elevation. But I see the treble as having potential. It's just, it does need a bit of fine-tuning in EQ. When I was doing my EQ, one of the things that I noticed was that as soon as I bumped up the treble a little bit and I added a little bit more energy to 100 to 200 hertz, it's almost as if the soundstage got bigger. I mean, it's not like the soundstage is small on this. It's actually fairly decent for a closed back. It's not like in your head. It's you're definitely like, the music is around you. It is not inside your head. And I also noticed that the difference between the closest point to the furthest point was fairly broad, and that allowed for a lot of room for an instrument separation and distinction. When certain instruments are thrown way right or way left, they can still come pretty darn close to you. Where there's other headphones, like actually the Tour is a headphone that, unlike this, it's got a bigger stage. I mean, it's also more open, obviously. It's got a bigger stage, and it feels like you're sitting further back. This one, you're sitting further forward, but the instruments go further, or at least as far. Now, if somebody were like, hey, here's a Clear or an Elegia, I would take the Clear every time. But, for a lot of applications, you don't have the luxury of having an open back. Say you're in an office, well, then this would be the better choice. And I don't think you'd be let down by it. Now, keep in mind, you do need to EQ this a little bit. Somebody's car alarm is going off. That's a lot of fun. But yeah, let's get into the comparisons. So, obviously, the comparisons with the rest of the Focal lineup, I would rate them as, Utopia, Clear, Elegia, LX. Well, actually, Elegia and LX, it's just different strokes for different folks. And then the Elegia further down. The most interesting comparison for the Elegia is the ZMF icon. The Elegia has more detail, it's got better resolution, and it is faster, without a doubt. But I think that the tuning of the icon is a little bit more agreeable for a wider range of music. More people will listen to put the icon on and go, oh yeah, that sounds great. Whereas with this one, it's really going to speak to people who are into a slightly more forward mid-range. If you do take the time to EQ this, then you'll get there. But if you don't like EQing anything, again, the icon is probably going to be a bit more pleasing. It just has like better timbral qualities, and it's going to be better with a wider range of music. Whereas this one is a little bit more clinical, and you're going to hear the flaws a little bit more. Another interesting comparison is with the Aeon Flow closed. That's actually a really good comparison as well, because they're both closed back. The Aeon Flow closed, to my ear, is still a little bit faster. The transient speed is just a little bit more. and so you get it. It's a little bit more punchy, but not enough. Again, we're talking like just a tiny bit more. And the resolution and detail of the Elegia is actually the one that's superior, and notably superior. Like, you hear details in the Elegia that you just don't in the Aeon Flow Closed. However, the Aeon Flow Closed is a little bit more of a traditional neutral tuning. Yeah, they're both clinical, and they both have good mid-range. The mid-range of the Elegia is a little bit more forward, and the Aeon Flow Closed is a little bit more just straight. I would personally take the Elegia over the Aeon Flow Closed, just because of the extra detail retrieval that you get with this. The detail retrieval and resolution of the Elegia is just enough to push it over the top for me. If I had to choose between the Elegia and, you know, some of those, like the THX00 and some of the Fostech stuff, I would take the Elegia every time. Just because, to me, they're more that sort of, you know, solid bass head kind of thing. I know that my preferences have changed, you know, over even the course of a few months, let alone several years. And maybe a few years ago, I would have, you know, listened to these and gone, nah, it's way too mid-focused. And now I'm finding myself more and more drawn to the kind of music that sounds good on these. As far as music types that will go well with this, definitely acoustic music, jazz music. What will go poorly with this is metal. If you listen to metal on this thing, you probably will be disappointed. If you think about where the bass guitar kind of bottoms out, it's right around that 100 to 200 hertz region. For a lot of it, I mean, I've heard some that does go lower. However, anything with more mid-focused instruments, or vocals, this is a wonderful experience, and I can't recommend it highly enough. If you do EQ it, that is. If you don't EQ this, I feel like you're going to run into that weirdness with upper mid-range, lower treble, where there's a bit of a cut with around 4K-ish, and so, you know, elevating that a little bit and then bumping up between 100 and 200 hertz. If you have one of these, give it a shot and let me know what you think in the comments. So the bottom line for the performance and the sound, detail monster. It's killer mid-range that I think is maybe just, some people might find it a little bit too much. You can EQ it, and one of the best closebacks I've ever heard, one of the better office headphones. It's not as good as the Clear, period, but it's damn close. If you are choosing between the two, and I have seen the Clear on sale, I would still get the Clear every time. It's maybe 90% of the way there. So I think they did manage to create a successful closed-back version of that headphone. All right, that about does it for this review, and let me know what you guys think about the format, because I'm going to experiment with a few different things this year and kind of try and hone in on something that works. I'm not totally sure yet what does and what doesn't. This is just sort of my year to figure this shit out and see what you guys like. So let me know, and thanks for watching.